Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Jensen. We are here with Module 2, Crime, Criminality, and the Media. We're going to jump into a few housekeeping things first, some material by Marcus Felsen, and then we'll go right into Chapter 2. So first, I often have students ask this question. My own majors, actually, they'll say, people will ask me about what are you studying at University of Florida? And I say criminology, and they say, oh, you mean criminal justice? And it gets a little confusing. So what's the difference between criminology and criminal justice? I don't know if you've ever had a professor do this for you, but this is the difference. Criminology is an academic discipline that uses the scientific method to study the nature, extent, cause, and control of criminal behavior. It's an interdisciplinary science involving two or more academic fields. So there isn't any one area that owns it, like sociology or psychology, economics, law, history. It's a combination of those fields, but it does borrow heavily from the social sciences. Criminal justice, on the other hand, is a system made up of the agencies of social control, such as police departments, the courts, and correctional institutions that handle criminal offenders. So one is very much the behavior, criminology, and the other one is very much the system, criminal justice. Now, you and I both know that you can't study the behavior without also studying the system, and vice versa. But hopefully now you're better able to demonstrate that you know what criminology is and you can describe it better to people wanting to know what you study. Okay, there's something I wanted to bring up from Marcus Felsen. And Marcus Felsen has a book called Crime in Everyday Life. And he brings in some of these media myths that I think are worth documenting. So it's not just this course or the Surratt text that goes into it, but a lot of scholars actually study the portrayal of crime in the media. So one of the fallacies of crime, or our beliefs about crime, that Felsen talks about is the dramatic fallacy. Students will often believe crime is exciting, dramatic, and emotional, but in fact most crime is actually quite boring. TV news is filled with stories of jealous lovers who murder, shootouts with police, child abductions, etc. And media use something that we call a horror distortion sequence about crime. So essentially it goes like this. They find a horrific story about a crime. They entertain the public with it because of the drama. They make money while creating a myth in the public mind because there are all kinds of inaccuracies with this portrayal. And then they build on that myth for the next horror story. And so it perpetuates itself into high drama and eventually trying to capture all crime. So we start to think that all crime is violent and all crime happens in these ways when in fact it doesn't. So this is what we call the dramatic fallacy. Most crime is actually non-violent and involves petty theft and not much drama. So think about it this way. We don't really want to hear on the news about kids that were stealing gum from the gas station. It's just not that interesting. And we very quickly dismiss it or reduce it as kids being kids or doing something silly, even though it is actual crime. But when we look at violent crime like murder, consider the murder mix. The public often think of murderers when they think of crime, but murders are actually very rare, so consider these data. Less than 1% of major crimes in the United States involve murder. However, murder gets the most resources, right? Because we have a dead body at the end and we want to make sure that we find out who killed this person, and it's a significant event to lose a loved one. But of the 15,000 plus murders in the US in any given year, these are the data that the media tell us about. 11 involved poison, 4 involved some kind of forced narcotics overdose, 46 were involved in rape, 7 were involved prostitute murders, 116 might have been gangland killings or sniper attacks. But then what about the other 15,000? What do you see and hear about on TV? There just isn't enough airtime or print space or web space to really cover every single murder. We're going to move on to other things. And so media has to prioritize which murders are the most interesting. But in that priority, a lot is left out. And there are many distortions that come with that selection process. A second fallacy that Felsen talks about is something we call the ingenuity fallacy. That criminals are so smart and that they've outwitted us. So we often get false images of crime which include the idea that it takes a level of intelligence or skill to pull it off. And this idea comes from television shows, books, movies, where criminals look very sophisticated. However, most crime involves little or no skill and even less planning. You'll see that many crimes involve spur-of-the-moment decision-making. And I mean, how hard is a stick-up? You know, if you're going to rob somebody, you just have to, I guess, have the courage to try to pull it off, but the raw skills it takes aren't really that difficult to come by. Home burglaries generally take less than 5 minutes and often involve more than 2 minutes. They might involve a little bit of planning, but it's nothing so, you know, incredible to say it just requires a little bit of observation to notice when people aren't home, things that would give that away. So oftentimes media feeds the idea that criminals deserve a lot more credit than they really do. It doesn't take a college degree to pull off many crimes. And they can be committed by people with varying intelligences. But let's jump into our material here when we talk about crime, criminality, and the media. So criminality, I often get asked, what does that actually mean? I know what a crime is. It's an action or behavior that someone did. But criminality is a quality or a state of being criminal. So we often use criminality as a descriptive term or an adjective to describe a person who is committing criminal actions. Recall from chapter 2 that we define and then we see. Okay, so oftentimes we will try to make sense of things in our head based on our own experiences, and then we'll go see if what's in front of us meets those criteria in our head. And we will make changes to help them fit each other, even if it distorts things and creates inaccuracies. So remember social constructionism that was talked about in the Surratt text? It's basically our experiences, symbols, and knowledge that develops our ideas about the world around us, and it can be subject to inaccuracies. But it's kind of our gut check and our knowledge as we have it right now, kind of left raw and unconnected to some of the things that are in front of us, and that's where we can have misconceptions. So let's think about all the different kinds of crimes that you may have knowledge of or been witness to or have thoughts about. So think about this. We have all types of crimes out there. You have crimes that involve families that get very, very messy. They can be very serious, like child abuse and neglect, involve incest, domestic violence, or partner violence. Or it can be maybe a little more trivial but damaging, like failure to pay child support, deviant marriages. We have crimes against others, and those are kind of the typical index crimes that we see from the FBI, like murder, fraud, theft, also known as larceny, arson, assault, robbery, burglary, kidnapping, rape, stalking and harassment, extortion, vandalism, embezzlement. We have crimes against morality, selling drugs, prostitution, sodomy, euthanasia, abortion, gambling, alcohol, or what we call public drunkenness, indecency and exposure, adultery, sadomasochistic activity, crimes against ourselves like taking drugs, selling our own organs, completing suicide, failing to take safety precautions like seatbelts, putting ourselves at risk. And we have more. We have public safety crimes, right? DWIs or DUIs, weapons without permits, trespassing, loitering, that's just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? Public order crimes like drunken and disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, public endangerment, rioting, shooting guns in the air, vagrancy or homelessness, violating curfew. You have public administration crimes that kind of erode our system, like jury tampering, counterfeiting, bribing public officials, voter fraud, perjury, lying under oath, tax evasion, things that would corrupt our public process. And we certainly have crimes against animals like animal cruelty, ritualistic practices, torture, brutality, and animal violence. So this list is not to overwhelm you and go, wow, I have not taken a class that quite covers all of that. But it's to say all of these crimes bring forward images and ideas about what we think about them. And chances are many of those images have not necessarily come from personal experience. That would be very tragic if it did. But many have come from media or things we've seen or things that have been told to us. So we get kind of a perception of what's actually out there. Now remember, Defining crime is a social reaction. And we can't really say something's criminal until we start to have a sense of right and wrong, a sense of morality, or a sense of emotion about it. We get reactions from legal specialists, and these are necessary to help us figure out what to do. So we have legislators that enact laws or make proposed adjustments to laws. We have police and other crime fighters that enforce with discretion whether something should be apprehended or stopped. And then you have lawyers and judges that try people in court. But the public reacts too. And these are the essential questions. Will society recognize and report an act as criminal? Or are we looking at things that are maybe criminalizing or decriminalizing something? And so these influences will call for enforcement or punishment or maybe leniency if something has become more normalized and just isn't that big of a deal anymore. So let me go forward and show you some of these law-based definitions so we don't lose track of these reactions. So in contemporary criminal law, acts prohibited by criminal laws constitute behaviors considered unacceptable and impermissible by those in power. Thus, criminal laws will serve a number of social goals, keeping us safe and identifying behavior that should not be going on. So these are the definitions we get from Latin. So we have mala in se, which is wrong in and of itself, and these are more of the morality crimes. Or we also have mala prohibita, meaning wrong as or because it is prohibited. So it might not be morally wrong, but there is a law on the books that says it's wrong, and so it's wrong because it's prohibited. And then in court, we actually use these definitions. Actus reus, which you've heard before, meaning guilty act, or the action occurred or existed, so we can't prosecute on thoughts necessarily, although we do have conspiracy and criminal intent laws for that start to demonstrate that you were about to act or you were doing active planning on someone's harm. Then you also have mens rea, which is guilty mind or intent. So basically the act and the intent have to occur together, and those are requirements for us to pursue criminal prosecution on someone. So media's role in defining crimes, legally or emotionally, involve our social reaction to them. So recall media's important role in criminal enactments, and we can see this probably most fully in things like copycat crimes, where we get ideas of something that might be interesting to do because we saw it in front of us on a TV show or a movie. You could also see the influence of enforcement, where media starts to say, hey, things are out of control. There are animals on the streets and we need a crackdown. There's public outcry, and it puts pressure on police departments to do things like police sweeps. Sometimes that public outcry is far greater than the actual data that show what's happening in maybe a criminalized neighborhood. It's more perception driving that reaction than actual fact. We also have the culprit of pretrial publicity that forces the change of venues for trials due to perceived unfairness or bias. So we'll have to shift trials to other cities, other counties, because there's a case to be made by the defense saying, my client cannot get a fair trial. There's too much social and media coverage and reaction going on that there's no way I can get a fair trial out of this. And so media is completely involved in our lives in these kinds of reactions and directly influencing enforcement, enactment, and trial outcomes. Other relevant social reactions to crime that we see that are very much driven by media are one thing that we call the vigilante, right? Citizen enforcement or self-help efforts. Eventually, some of these turn into crime prevention campaigns, which we'll get into a little bit later in the course. But this is where people feel what's being shown to them has, hit its peak and they are compelled to act. And clearly the police aren't doing enough about it, so I'm going to go in and take the law into my own hands. We also have a perpetuation of a fear of crime, and I'll show you some data about this in a moment. So the fear of crime is really based on perception. And really, when we think about it, our perception is the reality that we operate under. So it doesn't matter really what reality is, because that does not influence our behavior. Perception influences our behavior. It's our translation or sense of what we think reality is that really governs our behavior, whether it's accurate or not, and oftentimes it is not accurate. So fear leads to reasonable precautions, possibly. This is where you get a lot of marketing of products and protections. You can't live without this lock on your door. You have to get this security camera. You need to wear this kind of protective vest or have this special carrier for your gun, or, and it starts to say you're going to be vulnerable unless you have these items. And sometimes those precautions are very reasonable and other times they're not. So again, but they're driven by a media-based fear of crime. Fear can also lead to what we call a fortress mentality or target hardening, which essentially is where we kind of, out of paranoia, lock ourselves in our homes, bars on the windows, we don't open the door to anyone, and we are our own fortress, and that's the only way we can stay safe, which doesn't make for good neighborhood cohesion. You don't trust people, you don't talk to people, it weakens informal social control, we don't let anyone outside. It's not a very pleasant way to live. Every person is their own island, and you lose a lot of utility in living in a neighborhood. So when you think about it, when children go outside to play, maybe in many suburban neighborhoods, sometimes you have kind of social control by other parents kind of monitoring things, watching each other's children outside, and that creates some security for the entire neighborhood. But if you're in a fortress mentality, you're not letting anyone out and you're suspicious of everyone, you start to lose some of that cohesion. Target hardening has to do with making it more difficult for a crime to occur. And again, that doesn't always make a neighborhood look very pleasant. And some people complain that it reduces their home values because it sends signals to potential buyers that this is a crime-ridden neighborhood. There are reasons bars are on these windows, and there are reasons that you see what you see, and so buyer beware. So those impacts are very significant. We ask ourselves the question, does media have impacts on these kinds of things? And we ask ourselves, have I been someone that has been persuaded by media to take these kinds of precautions? So let's look at the data on fear and crime. So this is data, you can get it from many places, but essentially in Gallup polls and the General Social Survey, we will ask questions like this. Is there more crime in the United States than there was a year ago or less? So kind of a comparison question. Do you think there's more crime, less crime, or is crime about the same? So this shows us over time, and this is 20 plus years of data, most people were reporting that there was more crime and it's out of control. And then, kind of over time, we see significant drops. And then, people start saying, oh, there's less crime. I think things are getting better. But this is all perception based, okay? And it kind of ebbs and flows. Very few people are saying it's about the same. But what does the data actually say? Here are the data, okay? So fear of victimization and violent crime since 1965. So now we have even more data to look at, and this actually goes until 2017. So when we look over time, the orange bar is people who say, the percent of people who say, I'm afraid of being victimized, and they're specifically responding to the question, yes, is there any area near where you live where you'd be afraid to walk alone at night? And this is the percent of people saying, yes, I would be afraid. And then the yellow is the actual reported violent crime rate from the FBI Uniform Crime Reports over time, which is the crime rate per 100,000 people. And so you can see many, many times these are out of sync with each other. We're very afraid of crime when we really shouldn't be. And then sometimes we should be more afraid of crime when we're not. And then you see little convergences here and there. But it's very interesting to see what the data actually tell us versus what people are feeling and thinking about. So these often don't line up very well, and media plays a huge role in that. Crime will create various social roles, and again, these are influenced by media. So we have the role of the offender, and media will help us determine who is the offender. You also have the direct victim who is injured or harmed. However, some crimes are victimless, like prostitution. Many people argue that prostitution is simply a business transaction between a client and a prostitute, and they're just paying for sex, and you know, they're both willing participants in the act. So who's the victim in that kind of crime? Or maybe drug users are considered victimless crimes. You know, they should have the right to put whatever they want in their own body. Who are they really harming other than themselves? You know, who's the victim here? We also look at, do these affect a sense of order and fear, you know, where our closeness to the victim might influence how we feel about it. We also have indirect victims. Government on behalf of society, public prosecutions are being held accountable. And then you have families and friends of both offenders and direct victims that also feel quite persecuted or to blame for what happens to their loved one or the behavior that their loved one perpetrated against someone else. And then you also have criminal justice participants. So these include witnesses, grand jurors, trial jurors, the courtroom work group, and correctional workers. And so these are essentially citizens that are very involved in the justice process. But again, these social roles are highly influenced by media as far as how we think trials go, who we think a victim is. Okay? Social roles involve group expectations about how to act. So these media portrayals will affect our expectations of offenders, victims, and criminal justice participants. And in the Surratt text, it reviews the dominant ways in which criminals, crime, and participants are portrayed publicly. And we're going to look at these in detail before we wrap up this segment. So the media emphasis today is currently on predatory criminals. So the media features depraved people, often in poor neighborhoods, committing violent, senseless but sensationalistic crimes. Even though we know that crime happens everywhere in every neighborhood, that is where you get the pictures, and that's where the pictures are more dramatic, and so there tends to be a lot of over-patrolling and over-coverage of poor neighborhoods, and so they get a little bit demonized. Media have really only recently discovered serial killers and our fascination with them, and they've decided this is a money market for them to tap into. The rate of serial killing really hasn't changed much over time, even though media might argue otherwise. When we track the data of serials, we just don't see that. And then criminals are portrayed as frightening, but this often contains dramatic audience and market appeal because some people really value being frightened or learning about the intricacies of a killing. It is a fascinating thing to study, but it starts to take over our perception of all crime. We also get what we call victim narratives from the media, where media emphasizes female victimization over male victimization, even though data already tell us that more males are victims of crime than females are. So essentially, there can be some gendered approaches to how victims are constructed by the media. So essentially, media might say this victim is helpless or weak, which is often the narrative we see with the females, versus a victim as avenging or bold, which is what we see with males. And will actually underscore their crimes and offenses in similar manners too. So the important victim narratives that occur include undeserving victims, and again, women and children tend to be in this group, even though you could say there's a case to be made for all victims being undeserving. No one asked for these things to happen to them. So why do women and children get more coverage when clearly there are males that deserve coverage as well? But essentially, the story is compelling to the market audience. It demonizes an evil predator, and that's where the market appeal comes in. You also have the victim narrative of the stupid victim, and this is where we get into victim blaming and the at-fault or participation of the victim in their own victimization, setting themselves up for failure, putting themselves in risky situations, even though the actual choice of the offender to act upon them is completely ignored. You also have the lazy victim. Well, it's, again, your fault. You were careless. You were not alert. You didn't take necessary precautions. And so it's your own negligence that is responsible for your victimization. We also have media inaccuracies. So violence is way overrepresented in the accounts and coverage that we see in the media. So we think that, America is under siege every day, when really it isn't. Property crime is way underrepresented. It's most crime. It's about 70 to 80% of all crime is property crime, meaning crime against your stuff, like damage or theft, okay? Media portrayals do not present accurate theories or explanations of why people commit the crimes that they do that can be empirically validated. It's very speculative and full of emotional reactions. And so they're just not well validated by science to say, yes, this adds up and this explanation meets the facts and the evidence. The other big problem is white-collar crimes are left out. So outside of high-level scandals, like we see of major investment firms or maybe celebrity investors, most white-collar crimes are just not compelling enough for media coverage, and historically they haven't been featured very much. This is changing a little bit in the 2000s and forward as we've seen more public interest in white-collar crime, but again, as far as coverage with other crimes, you just don't see a lot going on there. So when you think of white-collar crime, you have to remember it's not just high-level executives extorting goods and finances out of firms or competitor firms, or maybe doing SEC violations and so forth. It can be sometimes payroll fraud and stealing from cash registers. It's usually an offender that is not a typical offender like we see portrayed. It's someone that has money, that has a job, and they just want more. So often what we call the moral panic literature is used to explain why we see what we see with white-collar crime. So white-collar crime involves no folk devil or some depraved perpetrator that is clearly after something they need, because most of the people that commit white-collar crime have their basic needs met and met very well. So white-collar crime is one of the most difficult crimes to explain because it's hard to find a motive. Often, seldom a disproportionate reaction to white-collar offenders. There's kind of no ebb and flow in the concern for them, and the punishments are really lopsided as well. You get short sentences, you get slap on the wrists, and so there's a little bit of disenfranchisement about whether or not the public takes these types of crimes seriously. And when these aren't really covered, it starts to kind of feed the beast. Often we make a judgment call on these crimes not being very interesting enough. Well, who cares that a payroll clerk embezzled some money from their employer? That's just kind of life as we know it. We just deal with it within the business or within the system, but it's not all that interesting in and of itself. So in wrapping up, criminal narratives are a big part of why you're studying crime and media in this class. So again, we see psychotic super predators using twisted, lustful revenge, random acts of irrational violence spurred by greed and selfishness, and this becomes the dominant image even though it doesn't fit most offenders. We also have business or professional criminals that are overrepresented, and again, that goes with those fallacies of criminals being really intelligent and highly organized, part of these crime rings or organized crime presentations that we're just outwitted or outsmarted by them, and again, that is really not true. And then you also get kind of victims and heroic criminal narratives, such as the one suggested by Robin Hood, where they're fighting against an unfair system, and so we kind of recharacterize criminals as maybe doing something on our behalf or attempting to change the laws. So these are kind of some of the themes that are important to pay attention to when it comes to studying media's direct influence on criminality. I hope this lecture has really helped highlight and emphasize the readings that you're doing and the material we have in Module 2, and we'll see you next time.